put a little disclaimer here to say that the opinions expressed during this podcast do not represent the opinions of Marshall, the library, HerdCon, or the English department. All right, Dr. Lumpkin, so you're teaching Appalachian Literature in the fall.
Yeah, I'm teaching just one section in the fall. It's something I teach film a lot, and I'll teach Appalachian Literature sometimes. I'm doing a section this fall. Online for those who don't want to get out of the bed.
I completely understand that. I think the days of virtual classes are gone, even though I think they were my favorite. You got a little mix of getting to stay in bed, but also getting that interaction and real discussion.
I was fond of my experiences, but yeah, all good things must pass, I guess, or bad things depending on the experience. So.
I understand. So before we get into the meat of what we're going to be talking about today, just what kind of literature are you going to be discussing in your class?
Yeah, I'm and again, in thinking about Appalachian literature, it is a region of America with regions within it. I tend to think about Appalachia as a zone of extractions, and that a lot of Appalachian narratives deal with extraction, whether it be extraction of natural resources, extraction from communities, extractions of individuals, and things like that. And we oftentimes, in addition to that, we often have a lot of assumptions about Appalachia, a lot of stereotypes. And I think oftentimes Appalachian literature does reinforce those stereotypes. And sometimes it pushes against it, and you see that in the same text that you're looking at. Usually I have some books that I like to always use. Denise Giardini's Storming Heaven is a favorite of mine. Joe Carson's series of monologues, stories, I Ain't Told Nobody Yet. West Virginia's own Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was from Mineral County. He had a memoir called Colored People, which is one I really like and one students really enjoy, although a lot of them in their responses say, I didn't know there were black people in Appalachia. Something to that, and also students who are, say, African American are just like, oh, I'm glad there is someone who has experience, writes about this place. And it's a good memoir about somebody who went on to be kind of a public scholar and famous, and he's on a TV show on PBS and things like that. And one of the ones I'm teaching this fall, a new one, is another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place by Nima Avashia, I believe. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she is kind of, her parents had immigrated to work in Chemical Valley, and her experiences growing up in that area around Institute and those places. So it's not a very long book, and it's quite a good book, and it does that kind of memoir thing where she tells about her life, her family, but also about a place that isn't really there anymore.
Yeah, I think that's really common in Appalachia. In these stories, it's like the place itself is a character. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of people who live and have grown up or were born in this area also feel that Appalachia is like literally someone sitting beside you in those cultural things. But these are great points to start our discussion on. Today, we're going to specifically be focusing on October Sky or Rocket Boys by Homer Hickman and J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. Me and Dr. Lumpkin kind of talked about before when we were setting this up what we wanted to discuss. And we thought these stories were really good parallels to each other because they're both poor white Appalachians who got above their raisin, as we'll talk about a little bit, and really found a way to make it out of here. But yet they're two very, very different stories. So with those parallels, one of the things that really stood out to me that I thought was really interesting in these stories was that Homer Hickman's book was all about a lot of the power of education. And, that education's a beautiful, freeing thing. But then we have J.D. Vance, who, for the most part of the beginning of his book, talks about how he was failing classes. And at one point, he even lies about having a Yale degree. I just thought that was a really interesting parallel. Do you have any thoughts on why those are so different?
I do think, having read both the books, you do kind of have this, and I think thinking about, these are, it may be a good question of whether one of these books is actually a memoir, and I would say the other one very much is that you have these two individuals who seem kind of, they're not juvenile delinquents, first of all, but they're kind of aimless and adrift in search of purpose. And in the case of Homer Hickman, he finds purpose in a very historical moment, the Sputnik racing across the sky. It seems something that was a common experience he writes about in the memoir of like people looking up in the air and they think they see Sputnik going around, and it's this amazing spectacle of a thing, and how that inspired him. The American effort, the American effort to start to build rockets, to get people into space, to get something into space to keep up with the Soviets. It's something that gives his life focus and purpose. And he does, he's not the best at math. I think something a lot of people can relate to. And he has to teach a lot of this stuff to himself. He has other people help him. There's a sense of community there where that he gives him that purpose and, that desire to want to acquire knowledge to accomplish things, I think was very big. As for Vance, a lot of it seems to be the thing that gave me purpose and focus was my mama. And that is something that is a long stand. Your granny figure, your mama, very much in a lot of Appalachian literature. These older women are often seen as the bedrocks of a community. They're the ones that are going to get things done. They are the power operators. They're the ones that'll look after people. There's that wonderful Bill Withers song, "Grandma's Hands." If you've ever heard of it, it's a classic. Bill Withers from Slab Fork, West Virginia. So there's a long tradition of those grandmother figures. And then also in the process of valorizing the grandma, he very much is very critical of his mother, which is pretty, there's a lot of that, generational conflicts dealing with that.
Yeah, that is a great point. Not one of the ones that we're focusing on, but when I took Appalachian film, we watched Harlan County. I think it was Harlan County, USA that had it, where there was a whole section of that film that focused on the women of the mine strikes and how they were really the heart of those labor disputes. And I thought that was really something that a lot of people don't think about when they're thinking about our region, is definitely how respected women are in a very different way.
And I think in that film, for all intents and purposes, the quote unquote stars of the documentary are the women, the miners' wives, even the elderly. They're out there, and I think this idea that working the mine is so exhausting that is the responsibility. This again, it gets into very kind of rigid gender dynamics, but the job of the miner, the male miner, the man in the mine, is, hey, I've got to go out. I've got to come back safe. I got to look after my fellow person. I got to get that coal, make that money, and we get the money to do the things we need to survive and hopefully have a better life. Whereas they are thinking about all these other things. The weight of, what do I do with the money? What do I do with the money? Where's the food coming from? How do we save the money? And it is perhaps not the most, I think, and you look at it in some ways that there's a lot of power in that, and that they're risking their lives, but the women are very mindful of the family, and they're the ones out on the picket lines. They're the ones with, I think there's one woman in that film. She's got a 22 in her bra, pulls it out at one point. So they're the ones. They are the frontline soldiers when the strike happens, because it's them, it's their husbands, it's their children that they're looking out for, and their community.
I think that's a really interesting point, and we're going to talk a little bit more about traditions, but I am from the heart of coal country, down in Logan County, where people are still coal mining every day, several family members, and that's still a very common family dynamic there, even 50, 70 years after, the October sky. we're still seeing down there this very focus on the coal miner and the wife who stays at home and takes care of the family, where I think a lot of places in the country, we're not seeing those stay-at-home moms as much as we are in those coal country or in these coal areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also just the, and I'm going by memes. I see that basically a lot of places it's a 2-income family. Everybody has to work full time. Sometimes the older kids have to work a part-time job, and it's not driving around money. It's money to help pay for food or the gas bill or whatever. I do think that's interesting about the dynamic, because I think Hickman in his memoir in particular obviously sees the value and the dignity in the working people who work the coal mine, but also even in 1950, he's looking back on 1959 from the late 90s, and he's still like, we're going to have to move on to other technology. We've got to do something else at some point. So it goes all the way back then, that even in the late 50s, there's this coal wood is going to run out of coal at some point. We're going to have to do something else.
I think that is a really good point. And I do just want to turn to tradition for just a little while, because it is something that is so engraved in Appalachia. But at one point, J.D. Vance says the whole world has experienced a wholesale abandonment of tradition. And I just don't think that we see that as much in Appalachia. My family still makes cabbage rolls every year, and we still hold those traditions very closely. Do you think that this is just J.D. Vance seeing his version of the world, or is this something unique to Appalachia?
It's hard to say what. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think Vance, and I'll admit this, Vance. There are a lot of people who say a lot of bad things about J.D. Vance, and I can't help but agree with them. To the point where, what do I have to add to this conversation? But I feel like a lot of, and this is something that Silas House had mentioned in a recent article, and one of the things and I may reference him a couple more times, but that he very easily falls into generalizations and anecdotes in his memoir, and what he cites as sources are a little suspect, and so a lot. I think a lot of tradition. It's a family thing, right? It's sometimes like. I have to think of something that's a suitable analogy, but your college experience is going to be different from everybody else's college experience. So if your family is not into tradition, that doesn't mean other families aren't, and you can't go to every family to see what traditional values are. I certainly think things like food more than ever is something that, it is in, you can find recipes on the internet and see people cooking online and make jokes about ridiculous things people cook on TikTok and things like that. But it's there are still, I think, traditions there. The question, I think, is, are the places where those traditions can happen still happen? Like the coal wood of Homer Hickman in the late 50s, early 60s is not. There's no, where do you need a place, you need a space to have traditions. If you don't have these spaces, they're hard, they may morph into something else, but they're not really they are often associated with places and times. I think about referencing another memoir, Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s Colored People. When he lived in Piedmont, there was a paper factory there in Piedmont, West Virginia. And they had basically a company picnic. And basically there was a segregated company picnic until about the 70s. Right as you went into the 70s. And it was very much a tradition, it was basically a big family reunion. People would, roast corn, buy the local bologna that was kind of very, very famous there. And once everything was integrated, that was a good thing, but those traditions and that identity and that connection that African Americans in that community had was somehow lost. So those spaces, those traditions. I do think, I as far as just I grew up in North Georgia. So I grew up right where Appalachia meets the Deep South. So I got it both ways. But at the very least, the amount to which a state like West Virginia wants to manufacture traditions or hold traditions up through festivals and events and even bad things that happen, like Mothman, those are things that obviously are there to bring people that are interested, not only from outside the state, but also people in the state to check those things out. So I think traditions morph into other things. I think he's just kind of really oversimplifying things here.
I think that you made a really interesting point about how here in West Virginia, I don't know about Appalachia as a whole, that we even make our heritage about the bad things that happen. Being here at Marshall University, twice a year we still have these ceremonies about our plane crash. And I think, at least in my opinion, that it really represents kind of the hopelessness of this area. And as heartbreaking as it is, that is a very common theme in Appalachia, is don't get above your raisin because it's not worth it anyway. So I think that us seeing these traditions out of tragedy just come from that hopelessness and that lack of future.
Yeah, I think particularly, I think in some ways, they also made a movie about Marshall, We Are Marshall, which was part of it was filmed in Huntington and part of it was filmed in Georgia where they get tax breaks. And it's weird because I'll watch films, all sorts of Hollywood films, and say, "Oh, that's Georgia. I know where that's at in Georgia, or I know that street, or something like that, or oh, that's my downtown." And so you have a lot of these, basically, I believe for the film October Sky, they filmed in Tennessee instead of West Virginia, and a lot of that has to do with This is a total aside, but a lot of this has to do with what kind of film office you have at your state and how you're ready to give out tax abatements for it. Like, oh, we can get refunded for some of the stuff if we employ people in Georgia. That's a complete aside. But I think certainly there is the tragic aspect, and then it's weird because I think it depends on it. So I think with Marshall, the crash was an awful thing. It greatly affected it. Even still to this day, people here are like, this is what changed, this is why WVU became much more, people wanted to invest more. The state wanted to invest more in WVU after that. This is a story that locals tell. But Marshall came back. Marshall fielded a football team. There's a whole movie about it. It's got us, the bad things happened, but we also continued on. There's that sense of maybe not prevail as there's the Faulkner in his Nobel Prize speech. The purpose in life is not to endure, but to prevail. Then perhaps at least enduring and continuing on is something. The whole Mothman thing is a very strange thing because it's like you're totally disassociating the awful tragedy and the accident with, a fantastical creature that was probably a sandhill crane. And yeah, in Logan, you've got Blair Mountain, and that was a defeat for the Union. And that it was a long time before things got better. You basically had to have FDR and the beginning of not just FDR, but that movement to have labor laws that accepted unions and negotiations and things like that. But it is seen as very much a flashpoint where it seemed like the country had gone a little crazy, at that point. You literally have people bombing miners,
Yeah, I actually grew up in the shadow of Blair Mountain in what used to be an old coal camp when I lived with my grandmother.
Oh, wow.
So we know plenty of that. And actually, to this day, if you still go up there, you can find like the casings still in the ground.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing, and I'm going to get off a little bit, but bring it back to this idea. The March of Blair Mountain was a huge, not just union thing, but a civil rights thing. It was one of the first times ever that we saw white men standing beside black men marching as equals. And it's actually where the term redneck comes from. It was because they wore the red bandanas. So I think it's really interesting how much rednecks were originally so open to diversity. You're working like I'm working, we're together in this.
Yeah.
And bringing that up, I think that that's another interesting thing about a parallelism between these books. Though I can't remember any place in October Sky where they specifically talk about people of color, but they do talk a lot about the immigrants and stuff and other communities, where J.D. Vance doesn't really, he focuses plenty on race, but I feel like that's more of a defense of why he had a hard life rather than Homer Hickman's acceptance for that diversity and how much he loved that diversity. Do you have any thoughts on their different representations of diversity or the way they handle race?
Yeah, and I think particularly in Rocket Boys, that you had people who would be from the region Appalachia, primarily Central Appalachia, Italian immigrants, African Americans, a lot of them from the South moving up here. And you have a variety of people. There's the Mr. Bykowski, and I think in some ways you have to say, in the book he's a character, he was a real person, and that they're kind of this kind, and I think Hickman, to his credit, does he clearly notes that things are segregated above the mine. That there's the black church. I believe Reverend Lanier is the pastor there at the Black Methodist Church, but there is this kind of acknowledgement of, and it's kind of like once you're under the mine, once you're under the ground, that you're looking out for everybody, and so it doesn't matter what your race is or what your ethnicity is. We all want to get back and get back home and take a shower and get paid. So there is that sense. I would hardly think it would be a kind of utopian system, but I think in particularly in places where segregation either overtly or legally or kind of economically was allowed, there was certainly much more interaction in a lot of those coal communities than a lot of different towns. As far as I think, as far as Hillbilly Elegy goes, a lot of it feels like the assumption is, and admittedly there is a significant majority of white people in Appalachia. We cannot deny that, but it is not wholly a monoculture. Whereas I think in Hillbilly Elegy, he plays into those assumptions, those easy assumptions that people have that in a lot of ways, this was something that Marshall grad Todd Snyder, he's written about his book, The Rhetoric of Appalachian Identity, and he did a book about his dad, 12 Rounds and Lose Jim. His dad was a coal miner, and he had a boxing training club, and he basically said, hey, he's just basically with J.D. Vance, he's telling us all the assumptions that we have about it, he's just telling those things. He's telling those same old stories again and again, where I think too, some of it has to do with the length of the book. Like Hickman's book is over 400 pages. So he has some time, and I do think he took a longer time to write this book. It feels, just in terms of the writing itself, he's not a poet. He doesn't have these like wonderful, odd, weird, but there's a sense of momentum. There's a sense of richness and detailing that he provides the world, where Hillbilly Elegy feels very surface level. And I think that's just the time and the thought one does in reflecting back on childhood, where they grew up, the communities they grew up in. And I think in a lot of ways that sense of community is something that makes a good memoir. Is that a memoir is usually about a certain time in somebody's life and a certain time in a certain place. And Hillbilly Elegy bounces around a lot. It kind of does. It's kind of, I would say, I'd almost be tempted. It's not quite you're driving along and on the interstate view of his life, but it's like a flyover kind of, like he's up in space looking down on his life. So there's not a lot of nuance. There's not a lot of complexity to it.
Yeah, I definitely also felt that. I felt like it was just someone telling me a story versus transporting me to where they grew up. Homer Hickman will tell you that he is not. I mean, he is a writer, but he does not consider himself one. And just like you said, that huge difference in writing, where I agree with you that Homer Hickam transports you to Coalwood, where J.D. Vance is just kind of like, oh, this is a thing that happened in my life.
It's a good example. If you've ever taken a creative writing class, one of the basics is show, don't tell, and that is good advice. And sometimes you have to tell things, but there's a lot of tell in Hillbilly Elegy. There's a lot that is just. I'm always reading this book. I was always like, why did this thing get so big? Why did this thing get so big, and why is this not? It's not incompetently written. It's just badly written. It's not interesting, but still, yet it hit at a certain time, and people reacted to it in a certain way. As I believe a lot of the reviews said, it's a Rosetta Stone for the white working class or something. That they use analogies that are the most obvious analogies.
I think that's a really interesting point, just because I think that it still exemplifies what Appalachia goes through with, we have these outside influences who really love this thing, and we're like, no, please don't. That does not represent us, and yet our voices still aren't the ones being heard.
Yeah.
It's still the outside influence that's really pushing this narrative. And I think that so often that voice does get taken away from Appalachians. They don't want to see it, or they don't want to hear what we actually have to say. And that brings me to the idea of poverty porn. For our viewers or listeners who don't know what poverty porn is, it is an exploitative kind of documentary that basically just shows how impoverished it is. It's not really bringing awareness. We know these areas. It's just there to make poverty entertainment. And it's very pervasive in Appalachia. What are your thoughts on the pervasiveness of this?
I think, and I would say that, and I think these are two different things, but in large part, Appalachian literature as a whole, it does focus on kind of more working class people. I think that is just as far as the amount. And also there is often a very strong and vehement response to that. So one famous notorious Appalachian work is Horace Kephart's Our Southern Highlanders. Horace Kephart was a Ivy League educated librarian. He was working at the main library in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm very much oversimplifying his life here, so if there's any Horace Kephart scholars out there, I apologize. But he was an alcoholic. He left his family and we went to go live at what was called a back of beyond. So he went to Hazel Creek, North Carolina, which is now part of the Smoky Mountains, fell in love with the place, wrote lovingly about it, hung out with a lot of what he referred to as the mountaineers there, and said it was like going back in time. Like, this is like primordial man. Something like, these are like people from the 1700s. Basically, that they were still living like that. And he talks about the adventures, and he writes many chapters on blockading, which is creating moonshine, and revenuers. It's more than you would ever want to know about such things. And a lot of people in that area complained because he didn't talk about the middle class people, because there were doctors, there were lawyers, there were teachers, there were people who had middle class lives, and he was focusing on that. I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of an interesting thing to ask ourselves, like who or what is Appalachian literature? What we consider Appalachian literature, and I think that's an amalgam of things that have formed over the years from different parts of the region that we think of as Appalachia. Is who is this for? Is it for the people from Appalachia? Is it from outsiders? Even if you're an insider, are you writing to those outsiders? And what are the things that interest them? What are the things that sell the books? Let's hear about the crazy moonshiners, or the ruffians, or the mountain men, or
The whites.
The whites, yes. The guys who hunt bear, like Big Tom Wilson in North Carolina. And it plays into that kind of, there's certainly that mountaineer, quote unquote, rugged individualism thing that gets associated with Appalachia. And this is a very convenient thing. Sometimes, like when the American Revolution happened, I think you can make a good case that one of the big contributing factors of how America eventually won that war was people from Appalachia who had rifles and they could shoot things directly, not just kind of scattered. They would shoot in battle. They would shoot people in the head, and that was something that freaked people out. And that was those mountaineers of Appalachia. They helped win that war. They were a contributing factor, and certainly even in the slaveholding states during the Civil War, so many Appalachians, North Carolina, Tennessee, joined the Union Army. They're like, hey, we're with, and it's interesting historically, and a lot of this comes out of a book by Stephen Stoll, Ramp Hollow, which is it's an excellent book. It's very detailed about the perceptions of Appalachia. And after the American Revolution, like, yay, Appalachians, you folks are great. And then as westward expansion moved, they're like, you guys are slow, you're behind the times. And then the Civil War happens, and we're like, you guys are all right. You fought on the right side, you helped us win the war. And so this kind of wave of appreciation for Appalachians, and then they're a burden. This is a whole historical cycle that goes through different phases. And so usually when a war happens, you have a state like Tennessee, which is called the volunteer state for a reason. And so you have a lot of these, willingness to serve, willingness to fight is certainly something that earns you some goodwill for a certain time in that.
I think that's a really good point. I know, I'm not sure if it's still accurate, but at one point, West Virginia was home to more veterans than any other state in the country. Mm-hmm. And, you made a really good point, and I wonder how much of that isn't just love of country, which we see, but also escaping this poverty.
Yeah. I think, too, and again, thinking about, like, working class Appalachians, Kentucky, West Virginia, any of those states, and seeing, and again, I make this simply as a parallel, but with a lot of Native Americans. A lot of Native Americans enlist in the Army, enlist in the armed forces. I did many years ago. I went to Wounded Knee. I went to grad school at Nebraska, so it was very flat. It's not as flat as you think it is. It's not like Indiana. Indiana has hills too. But one of the things that struck me, it's a church and there's a cemetery there, is how many of the graves had soldiers people who had served in the armed forces in some way was noted in that. And that it is a place that, where are your opportunities? This is something that Homer Hickman's book and the film talks about, and this is even something that J.D. Vance talks about, is like joining the military. This is a way out. This is a way to provide opportunity. And certainly after World War II, you had the GI Bill, which was something which, Vance talks about that there are all these different people. He gives an analogy that all these people are serving for all these different reasons, and that could be the case. But their sense of duty to country, sense of searching for opportunities for someone is why someone joins. It's a way out. There's no other option. So what do you do? So yeah, and hey, let's face it, recruiters know this, and they seek out those populations. You're not seeing a lot of recruiters in the nicer parts of states.
Yeah. When I went to high school, we basically had an Army recruiter who might as well have had an office in our high school.
Yeah.
So definitely very common there. But I wanted to go back to something that you were talking about Appalachia. We already talked about tradition, but being this isolated time capsule, which I find really interesting. Because though I was born in West Virginia and mostly raised, I did spend some time in Texas. Mm-hmm. And in Texas, the name brands that made me popular or fit in there made me a weirdo in Logan, which I found very interesting. And I don't really think the internet is changing much about that. It might shock people that we listen to pop music and rap music, but still we have this divide. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of regions, and I mean, I speak mostly for about West Virginia, still don't have access to fast internet, or their libraries are so small that they just do not have this access. And I think that it's one of those things that compounds on that poverty.
Yeah. I mean, it is just, the kind of thing is, the people who can do well on their SATs are, they get classes, and they are able to take the test more than once. So it is, a lot of it has to do with resources, and you have a place like Appalachia that is so resource rich, lumber, minerals, coal, and yet and this tends to happen with places that are resource rich around the world, as they tend to be exploited, and the money goes somewhere else.
Talking about the exploitation of, our natural resources and our people, one of the things that I was horribly shocked by in Hillbilly Elegy was J.D. Vance making the assertion that the drug companies and the outside influences aren't what's bringing drugs and the job crisis to Appalachia. And as someone who has lived in Appalachia almost my entire life, that just feels patently wrong to me. My husband is right down the road from Kermit, where, if the drug companies pumped in like 10 million pain pills into a community of maybe 2,000 people. So, where does J.D. Vance get this idea that we haven't always been a victim of carpetbagging and outside exploitation?
Yeah, I think, and I think this is the thing with something we had talked beforehand, is and this is something that Silas House brings up in the article I'm referencing, is Hillbilly Elegy a memoir at all, really? Because I think he calls it's basically a treatise, and I think that may be a better way to think about it, is that he's pulling that kind of, a very old sense of like people dealing with addiction. It is a failure. It's a failure of character. It's a lack of responsibility on somebody. And yet you see places that are poverty stricken, places where resources are limited, rates of alcoholism, rates of drug use, rates of addiction are invariably higher, because, if you're in a better economic situation, you may use drugs, depending on what alcohol, whatever the legality of things are in your particular state. But if you have a home, you have a comfortable life, you're less likely to be in those statistically, you're less likely to be in those kind of situations. So it has this kind of snowball effect on people. And yeah, I mean, and basically the drug company, particularly Purdue Pharma, I'm sure the audience may have read articles or seen documentaries or films related to that. They just thought, the more drugs we make, the more money we make, and the hell with communities and things like that. I mean, those are things that break up communities, that break up families. And certainly getting off of, and I'm not an expert on these things, but it's particularly getting off of opiates is a very extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And a lot of things people, they had a tooth removed, they had an accident, and they get hooked on these things. And it's very, very hard to get off them. And you're going to be dealing with that for the rest of your life. So it is a classic profits over people. Now, I think to what extent did somebody like J.D. Vance know, I'm going to make a book and then I'm going to run for political office someday? But that is not an uncommon thing. Barack Obama's first book was clearly kind of laying some groundwork that he was going to eventually go into politics. There's nothing inherently wrong with those things. But J.D. Vance comes from a decidedly negative point of view. Like where I've come from, you could say we have our challenges, we have our difficulties, but there's a lot of things he could have done, but he takes it from an extremely negative position and, does a lot of blaming of everybody in their shortcomings. The one example early in the book is he's working the summer job in Kentucky, and he's got the coworker who is he's just lazy and he takes long breaks and he doesn't show up, and that he has that person stand in for all the world's ills in Appalachia. So
I think that you're making a really good point there, and it brings me to a question that I had kind of highlighted and wanted to bring up because it's so strange to me. So in October Sky, Rocket Boys, Homer Hickam really focuses on how hard everyone works. We've already talked about the women, even as stay-at-home moms, they were doing things, or maybe even running their own. They were making lunches and making their own money a little bit. But J.D. Vance claims that his peers are immune to hard work and states that nobody is interested in a job. And as someone from Logan, that's really strange for me, because even if someone doesn't have what you would consider, they're not paying taxes or they're not on a payroll, they're out walking saying, hey, I'll do any odd job you have, let me help. And I felt like that those two things are so at odds with each other. This idea that Appalachians are immune to hard work, and yet our whole history is built on our backs.
Yeah, it's a huge contradiction here. I don't mean to get political here, but I think about the best example I can think of this right now, and this is like the way the GOP views Joe Biden. He is either infirm or a criminal mastermind. He cannot be both. It just seems very strange to me that they'll just bounce between those narratives willy-nilly. And that seems to be something that clearly J.D. Vance is putting in the Appalachians are fundamentally lazy lane. And then you have a whole history of that. Now, I think one of the things that it kind of gets hinted at is something that is brought up in Rocket Boys when the 1960 presidential election. In that you have Humphreys and you have Kennedy coming in, and there's a lot of this stuff. We need to get money. We got to get money. We got to get help. We're going to get both of them are basically like trying to get your vote. This is what politicians do. Whatever you can say about a politician, like if they get elected, then that's the one thing they're good at. And not that all politicians there are good politicians out there, but that this idea that at some point this creation of what they would call a welfare state, which something in Europe they would call the social safety net, that there is like a baseline of basic needs being met. That is the thing that we used to be hardworking because we had to work. Now we're lazy because, hey, we can get welfare, we can get food stamps. We don't want for anything. And it's a little bit like whenever we got those checks for COVID relief, and nobody they gave you $1,200 or $2,000. What was the first check? Was that like $2,000 or something?
Something like that.
Yeah. And they're like, nobody wants to work now because they have $2,000, and that's not going to last. It didn't really last that long when you had to pay your bills. That because you have this trying to help provide for basic needs and basic care is seen as anathema to hard work, which that generally has not been the case in other places. So it is. He's playing up to that. I think he's playing up to those kind of dog whistles. Vance is, and I think to a degree also. I think that's a little bit hinted at in Hickam. Is that this is the thing that he's very much suspicious of politicians saying they're going to bring in a lot of money. There's a funny line in it where talks about wanting to retrain miners, and it's something that just gets a laugh from some of the characters in the book because what are you going to retrain them in? Where are they going to get retrained? And this is a kind of, again, something in the late 50s, early 60s is already been talked. We need to retrain people in Appalachia. Well, what jobs will be available for them to get retrained for? So
I think that's a really good point. I don't know how well you remember it or if you were in the area, but around the 2012 election, Barack Obama gave all kinds of money to start those retrainings. And during that time, a lot of people from my hometown were like, he doesn't understand. This is what my daddy did, and this is what his daddy did. And like, it's like these jobs themselves are traditions. Returning to this idea of tradition. And I just found that really interesting, that even when the sources are there is actually a community college in Logan that has these abilities. But I can say that over the years, I've seen more and more people going that route. I have cousins that were in the coal mines who are now doing other things because they got other training.
Yeah.
But this idea of, did you ever think I don't want to do something else? Was always very interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think Hickman talks about that there is a scene that you feel like you just have I had a lot of mixed emotions in the scene where his dad, Homer Sr., takes him into the mine and shows him the mine. He's very proud, because his dad he's clearly a workaholic who was married to his job, and he's better than a lot of people who manage coal mines. I think he was thinking about safety first. He doesn't like the union, obviously. They're getting in the way, but he was always looking out for and someone who didn't have a degree in engineering, knew a lot about it just from that experience. And he shows him that space, and is very telling. He offers him, "I'll pay for your school if you want to be a mining engineer," which is like, I get a chance to go to school, but my dad only sees me doing this kind of job, not necessarily but somewhere else after the mine is kind of it's been mined out, and he just he's a teenager in Tackless, as the story goes. And he just says, "No, I don't want to do this. I want to build right. I want to be that kind of engineer," and it very much breaks his dad's heart. And I think if he was a little older, he'd be like, "Maybe let me think about it. Thank you for showing me this. Let me think about it." But it is a very kind of striking kind of moment that also his dad believes in him. Who he even admits in the book that he's had a kind of cold relationship with his dad throughout his life. And that his dad's proud of him and wants him to do well, but he wants him to do well in a very particular thing, which he ultimately doesn't want to do. And I think it is a lot. I mean, one thing to think about is how many generations back does coal mining go? We were basically, I guess, seriously started mining around the 1850s or so. And then it got more and more industrialized. So it's not like coal mining has been apart for thousands of years. So it is. Is there a recency bias to this? But it is like you were in the moment. That is your tradition. 7th generation, 8th generation. I see a lot now where I think about musical artists, something like Sturgill Simpson or Tyler Childers. Is that they don't refer to them? They come from 6th or 7th generation coal mining families or something like that. That now you're not the coal miner for the majority of people, but you're from a coal mining family. So there is this legacy of that, and that's something that often gets, and it is one of these things that is true that Central Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia. All those Pennsylvania, they mine the coal that built the steel that made America. Is this kind of thing? Coal
keeps the lights on.
Coal keeps the lights on. They still play whatever radio station, whatever. I'll still hear the Coal is West Virginia commercial. I can never find. I can only find that on the radio. They don't even have. I can't even find a YouTube clip of that to listen to. It's just kind of Coal is West Virginia, and so you are you are something that is a resource that is to be expended and disposed, and the wealth goes away. It goes to somewhere else. So it is, and I think there are other traditions like farming traditions and other mining traditions and fishing traditions. There are all of these industries that often have, multi-generational family members doing it, where they've all been stressed in some ways. Nowadays, if you're from a fishing family, if you haven't noticed, the oceans it has some issues that it's dealing with things like global warming, and overfishing. And so that is something that hurts the livelihood. But what happens when we don't have any more fish to fish from the oceans, which is, what happens when there is no more? There is a point where coal will be unprofitable. So, and it's something that Hickman says in his book, we have to think of something else. But we've had that point of where we have to think of something else for a long time now. I did remember, that's probably, and I teach Appalachian Lit every couple of years. I think it was like 2018 class. They were very, everyone, I first came here in fall 2012, so some of those first classes, they were a little hesitant to talk ill of the coal industry. I know one student, very, very soft-spoken gentleman, and he said, I'm not from a coal mining town. So he felt like I can't really say how I feel about it because I'm not from that place. And then 2018, we've got to find other industries to do here. The coal is a dying industry, but they've been saying that pretty much since after World War II. So it is one of those things. It's like, the United States needs to have a comprehensive energy policy or things like that. There are all these things we need to do, and we still haven't done them because people, there's not the will to invest in those things. And that leads to places like West Virginia, Eastern, being sacrifice lands.
Some of the things, it's kind of come up in our discussion already a little bit, but both of these books have different takes or maybe even similar takes on this idea of class warfare or class betrayal. At one point, J.D. Vance's grandmother's like, no, we don't, I can't remember if it's steal or rob from them. There are people. What are you talking about? Where in October Sky, we see that Homer's dad almost gets shot. And, how do we see this class betrayal or these class wars happening in Appalachian literature outside of October Sky and Hillbilly Elegy?
Yeah, I think there's obviously the whole... a lot of this is a variation of those stories related to the Hatfields and McCoys. I feel like that it's not. I can't know for sure if that is the kind of the text of these kind of things, but it has that kind of spectacle of two people fighting in the mud as you're walking across the street. It's just like you cannot look away at it, and certainly see in something like Hillbilly Elegy the descriptions of violence and violent behavior and the kind of openness of being, getting into an argument in the street and things like that. And there was also the story of Vance's mama setting his grandfather, his papa on fire. Again, he wasn't there for that, but it is something that is like almost like a family lore kind of thing. And so it has that spectacle kind of aspect. And it's one of those things where I don't necessarily think it's for people from Appalachia. It's for the outsiders that want a good spectacle. I do think with October Sky, the various thefts and where we kind of came across more as ingenuity. Like, where do they find scrap? Who do they coerce into making rockets for them? All the cleverness, and that in some ways, Homer's father, however aloof he is sort of kind of encouraging them. Certainly his mother, Elsie, is very much encouraging of these kind of, it has a feel of like boys being boys in a better way than the bad way we think of boys being boys. Boys will be boys, and that it hints at a kind of ingenuity and pluckiness, and we're going to figure things out. So that I think that's something where we see that as something that is positive, like and in a lot of ways, I think early on they're finding abandoned material, stuff that they can sell, stuff that they've kind of put together. They don't really have a rocket building kit. There's not like something that they order in the mail and then they get and then they build they had to figure that, as the book depicts it, they're figuring all this stuff out on their own and using what materials they could find or what materials they could coerce from the machine shop and things like that. So I think it's something that, one thing, I think it focuses the story much better and it shows the community involvement. So, but they do always get caught in that. Everybody knows what they're up to. So there's a sense of Colwood being this kind of system where people are going to find out, and there's some things we can let slide. So it harkens back to this more innocent time, whereas any sort of misbehavior in Hillbilly, the cops are calling, or something like that. So, and I generally feel like it is that, it's a little bit like, and I was probably one of the last of a generation to be like, they'll just let me run outside in the woods for an hour or two, just wherever I go and come. And, I loved it. It was great, and that didn't necessarily have to, someone would have to call the cops or Child Protective Services or things like that. And I know it's a different world that we live in, but yeah, it's the world of October Sky seems like a fun world to be in if you were a teenager.
Yeah, going back to the idea of Appalachia being a different time period, still into the early 2000s, it was just be home by the time the lights should come on. Mm-hmm. Like it was very much, you might go to a neighbor's house and they might give you a popsicle or a snack. It was very much this, it takes a village. And I feel like with our dying communities that we're losing that as well, that it's not something, this isn't a technological problem. This is our communities are dying and therefore we don't have the same infrastructure to support that kind of play.
Yeah, I saw some recent, it was probably an older one, but, West Virginia's own Jennifer Garner talking about growing up in Charleston. And like, I got home and my mother wasn't there. I'd go to a neighbor's house. If she wasn't there, I'd go to this person's house and raid their kitchen. That sense of, and it has this kind of nostalgic veneer about it. That this is a world that makes sense in some ways. That, in October Sky, they're constantly hitchhiking and doing all sorts of hopping onto the backs of vehicles and doing all sorts of stuff. And I think it is on that level. I think kids having to read the book, I could see why it would have its appeals because they're out unsupervised making something, but they're also out there having a good time. So,
for sure. So we haven't really talked about this yet, but I think that it does play a big role in the differences of these books, but the time era of these books. I mean, we have one during the time of Sputnik, mm-hmm. but the other one is much, much later where we've already started having the drug epidemic. How much of a role do you think? Because we've already talked about how Appalachia itself is a different era from everyone else.
It's outsiders think that it is. I think it's not that's part of that narrative. So I would say, but anyway, I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. So how do you think that just being from different time periods changes the way that Homer and JD talk about a very similar area? Yeah,
that's an excellent question. I mean, I think so. Hickman's talking about the late 50s, early 60s, and he gets his book published in 98, 99. Actually, the movie got greenlit, which helped make the book possible because they were going to put that movie into production, and then that got the book out, which I think nowadays probably people come to it first with a book, whereas Vance is writing, again, Vance was like 32 when Hillbilly Elegy came out, and he even acknowledges in the opening, I'm, what am I doing writing a memoir? Which, again, we should question whether this is a memoir or not. I think there is looking back, I think in something like Rocket Boys, that's 40 years that's going back. And I feel like Hickman, I believe his first book had come out in like 88, 89. And this was his second book. So he'd been working on it probably for a while is my assumption. And it has a certain nostalgic glow to it, I would say. I think he doesn't paint the place as a utopia. He obviously talks about the struggles, the disrespect that his high school and his town gets, the challenges that they have. But it is. He also talks about the good things too, and so I think it has a certain. It does have that kind of glow to it, I think. Whereas Hillbilly Elegy, it's very recent comparatively, and so I would it have been better if a sufficient amount of distance, and then it wouldn't have come out in 2016, so we would not be having this conversation at all about this particular book. I think maybe, perhaps, he might look at things a little bit differently. I think clearly Hickman. And he admits in the opening of his book that some things have been, there's some there's some liberties and licenses that have been taking place, and I think he does that to dramatize things. I think it works for telling a better story. And Vance generally seems to be like very confident that this is what it was. This is my story. This is my perspective. And I think it feels it. In a weird way, it feels like because it talks about his mother and the addiction that she was dealing with, that it feels something like as far as the time frame, it feels like a harbinger of what's to come. That story, And I think I remember in 2016 we had all those overdoses in Huntington. It was 26, which they had managed to basically save everybody, which, was an awful thing, but it also like just the dedication of emergency workers to make sure that happened. And so these things coming out at the same time obviously it's a book that caught a moment that we're still very much dealing with the opioid crisis.
I mean, we even right around that time had Netflix's Heroin come out, which focuses once again on Huntington and our emergency services and how we have tried to deal with our drug issue. So both of these books have this idea of home and the different things that home can mean. As someone who grew up in Appalachia, I know that I did not relate as an Appalachian until I moved to Huntington, actually. I was well into my 20s before I felt comfortable saying that I was an Appalachian. It was always something that I felt very big disconnect to. But this idea of home in Appalachia, how do we see it portrayed throughout Appalachian literature?
First thing, just to talk a little bit about the coming realization of your Appalachianness or Appalachian identity. I would say that's not uncommon. That it's a weird thing. It's a weird thing to say. Is that sometimes that happens? Students come to school and they realize sometimes you go to a different place and you realize I'm hesitant to say coming out, but yeah, you kind of realize like, wait a minute, I do have these feelings, I do have this connection. I feel connected in some way to that place, that identity. And that's, I would say, again, someone who teaches Appalachian Lit, that happens from time to time. So I think that's a normal. Sometimes you move to a new place and it helps you realize and see better the place you were at before, and things like that. I'm sorry. I wanted to answer that. What was your question again about?
What constitutes home for Appalachians?
Yeah, I think that's a touchy subject. Maybe I can talk a little. Maybe I can give a few personal experiences. So. Technically, in the Appalachian Regional Commission's designation of Appalachia, the county I grew up in, Cherokee County, is right at the end of Appalachia. And the whole ARC is a questionable thing. Like certain counties wanted to be it because they could get some money, and other counties like, we don't want to be associated with Appalachia. No. And so what's strange to me, and I went back home not too long ago, was it's so changed from what it was. I basically was rather rural where I was growing up. Again, woods to walk around in. Family's land eventually became high density housing for senior citizens, wealthy senior citizens, that so much so that my own mother couldn't afford to live in a house in that after we sold that land. And it's just a different place. And I think the most recent report I'd read that like Cherokee County, Georgia had now been fully developed. So maybe technically it's not Appalachia. I was there when it was Appalachia, but it's not Appalachia anymore. And so this idea of home, so does that mean I am quote unquote homeless because the place where I basically spent the first 18 years of my life is now the place is completely and utterly unrecognizable. And this is something that also happened to Hickman. The place that he knew as he knew it is very different. And the same thing for Vance, Middletown, Ohio. The place that he knew growing up is very different from the place that it is. That he was literally there when it transitioned from, a company town to kind of a place in economic decline. I do think people that have a strong identity to home in a particular place. I don't want to use the word privilege, but there are a lot of people who move around a lot, and I think it's unfair. Not just military brats, but I think people who, by their economic circumstances, their family's economic circumstance, they had to move around a lot of places. But again, it's like there are impoverished people that have to move around a lot. There are poor people who are stuck in places. Those are different dynamics. Home is this kind of social construct that we have. It's something it's something she's like, it's in the heart, and whatever you want to call home. I mean, certainly I've lived in Huntington now for 11 years, and I certainly consider it my home. It's the place I've lived the longest outside of where I initially grew up. So it is a peripheral thing, although I think in a fair amount of Appalachian, there's a lot of stories, Lee Smith's oral history, things like Storming Heaven, Denise Giordani, a lot of stories about characters and their connection to land, connection to property. And then I would want to add that whose land was it before these white people lived in these places? Yeah, these were lands that were dispossessed by Native American groups, indigenous groups were dispossessed of those lands. Just to fairly acknowledge that. Ultimately, we are all, in the grand scheme of things, human beings generally are on the move. We'll go where the resources are. Believe me, if there was no water in West Virginia, we would have to leave. We would go somewhere else.
They're working on that.
Huh?
I said they're working on that.
Yeah, none of it'll be usable, I hate to say. So, but yeah, sorry if I'm ranting here.
You're okay. I really like what you said about this homelessness because, as I mentioned, I moved to West Virginia. Well, I was born here, moved away, and then moved back. And the day my mom moved me back to Logan, my one goal was to leave. I did not want to be there. And so I definitely had this feeling of homelessness when people would talk about how much they loved it or how they never wanted to leave. That was just something that I couldn't relate to. And it was like I lived in Huntington before I finally found that place that I thought was of home in West Virginia. But yeah, that sense of not connecting to where everyone else connects to is just one of those other things that makes it hard to find home.
Yeah. And it's sometimes I envy people who are like, yes, this is my home. I feel comfortable in this space. But it can be something that is, very superfluous and ephemeral and temporary. I'm just saying the same thing in different words. But yeah, I think, at the aftermath of Katrina and that dislocation of so many people in New Orleans, I mean, that's a huge, that is a migration that happened out of that. I understand both. I understand the connection people have to a place home, and I also understand the people that are like, they're just wherever, I'll figure it out.
For sure. As I said earlier, I really related to what you were saying about these interests taking away land once again. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the shadow of Blair Mountain, on land still owned by the coal company that my grandmother paid rent to. And slowly, as that community is dying, because they're older people, they're not letting family members inherit those lands or those deeds, and they have to move the house or it gets demolished. So I definitely understand how much those have changed. I actually went back at Thanksgiving, and it was one guy has completely blocked the road that they've had issues with even ambulances getting up there, and it is really heartbreaking to see places that you have such fond memories of be so different. So definitely really relate to that. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about just here in the last couple of minutes is this idea of migration. So October Sky talks about how very few people make it out, how it is a big, huge thing if you make it out of there. You're above your raisin, whatever it may be. But Hillbilly Elegy talks about these huge migrations that are happening out of the area. I cannot remember the name of the road he talks about, but it's the main thoroughfare to get out. What are some of the factors that we see in Appalachian literature about why people stay or why people leave?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, that's one of the things that, if you've ever, you familiar with A Christmas Story, the film, stories of Gene Shepard, and one of the things that takes place in Gary, Indiana, and talks about the Kentucky hillbillies that are the neighbors, and they have their hound dogs and things like that. So that's a clear example of this kind of out migration for work that happened historically, and you could see that basically people from Appalachia moving into the Midwest for job opportunities, and how we think about, in a sense, we like Appalachia as a region has a lot of these kind of out valves where that's where people go. Like growing up in Georgia, the idea, of course, where I lived, I always like to think about it like this: everyone north of me, they're backward. And everyone north of us and everyone south of us were hoity-toity and stuck up. So we were just right. And I'm sure every county, up or down, thought the exact same thing. This idea of, where, almost like you're thinking about and thinking in terms of it like a river, is how people flow into certain areas. Your Atlanta, your Charlotte, things within Appalachia, Asheville, Charleston, West Virginia, Roanoke, Nashville. Again, a lot of your kind of musicians coming out of Appalachia, they're going to end up at Nashville at some point in some way. So having this sense, so there is the region itself, but then it is the migration of that, the spreading of those in groups and families to job opportunities, and also the connection that they have, because that was certainly, they called it basically the Hillbilly Highway. I can't remember if it was US 23 or US 52, and I'm sorry if I get things mixed up. But yeah, that was something that's something that I guess Vance has his tentative connection to Appalachia, is that he goes back to Eastern Kentucky, to where his mama and papa were from, and has that connection, almost like a vampire that has to sleep in the soul of his home country. He gets restored there. In the film version of Hillbilly Elegy, Kentucky is depicted as this immensely green place. They clearly put it's very CGI, digitally enhanced, color corrected. It's very green there. And it's just nothing else is going on. There's no bad stuff. It's just, there's some rundown houses and cars and And there's a part where he kind of is attacked by relatives and they try to drown him and gets in a fight and stuff like, no, they weren't relatives, but some local boys trying to bully him or whatever. But it's a green, wonderful place there in contrast with a much more dusty, rundown looking scene in Middletown. So you have a lot of, I think, that sense. And I think it can be a case with a lot of places, is that we see this is the region, but the tentacles of it reach out in some ways.
So we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but we haven't talked about it directly. So social capital and the way it functions, we see it functioning differently in both books. And we definitely know that it functions differently outside of Appalachia. But what does it say about the way these books portray our social capital? What is it? I don't know the question I'm trying to ask here. But yeah, just how social capital is different in Appalachia, or at least in Appalachian literature, versus everywhere else.
Yeah. I think... Well, I think one also thing, going back to the getting out, is obviously the Colwood is totally obsessed. The Colwood of Homer Hickham's Rocket Boys is totally obsessed with football. What's changed? What's changed?
Sure.
The idea that the way to get out is to play football and get a scholarship somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so that is something that is, we will submit our strong teen boys for sacrifice every fall. To the football gods, and so that is something that seems to be a tradition that's rather eternal so far. But football hasn't been around that long. But we'll see how long that one lasts. But it feels such an ingrained thing. I think with social capital, I think it's like which one to start with here. I think with Hillbilly Elegy, he seems to want to switch it whenever it's convenient for him. Which, that idea of code switching, mm-hmm. or I'm going to be a certain way around these people, I'm going to be a certain way around these people, and not because it is to my advantage to do those things. So you can certainly see that in the way he presents himself, and the way he uses that. I mean, one thing is that he was encouraged, J.D. Vance was encouraged by one of his mentors, Amy Chu, who was the author of Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom, which I am working through, was, hey, you have an interesting story. Why don't you write about it? And so that is, ultimately, what is so interesting about his story? Again, this book is a boring book. But what is the story he can tell? And the thing is that he plays a lot on that Appalachianness and not the Rust Beltness of things. Much more so. He much more strongly associates with that Eastern Kentucky, his mama who is from Eastern Kentucky, and not his mother who was born and raised in Middleton, Ohio. And just to be sure, there is certainly Appalachian Ohio. I look out my window every day and I see it across the river, the Ohio. So there are certainly parts of Ohio that would definitely define as Appalachia. But I think with Hickam, you can see the ways in which social capital works within the town. That everything I also kind of think about both of these stories. They're not necessary. Are they? Both of their families were working basically. It's basically working kind of middle class to lower middle class jobs. So Hickham's father was kind of a manager, superintendent, a manager of the mines, and that afforded him a certain lifestyle that was better than, say, the average miner. And there's a certain respect and trust that comes with that, because he's kind of in between. He's in between the company and he's in between the miners. But that's certainly it's something for Hickam, as he writes it. Growing up, there's a lot of that can be a good thing and that can be a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Like particularly when it's a strike, he's going to get beat up on the streets and things like that. Or they're going to shoot some bullets into the house, which his parents think nothing of at all. It's like, yeah, this is just the usual. So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
No, I definitely think it does. And, one of the examples that we've talked about tonight that I thought about of today that I thought about of social capital is that legacy of, well, I'm 7 generations coal miner, and how, like, that is a real thing in these towns. Like, when I was in grade school, we had the whole coal festival where all of the children were encouraged to make art or do some kind of social studies or science project around coal. And it's just, being a coal miner is like more upheld than being a doctor, or it seems that way. And I just found that as a very interesting social currency.
That's a little question then, that from your memory and your experience. How in those celebrations, how much was the union talked about?
Very little.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was not much talking about it. It was more just the coal miner is what we're celebrating. Because, I guess Massey Coal did have a big part in it. My mom worked for the city of Logan for a little while, and Massey would throw a whole coal fair where only if you worked for the city or if you were a coal miner, you could get a special shirt to get in, and you could ride fairs, and this was on the school property. Like, so yeah, it was definitely very put in there by the company. Like, I don't know if you remember when Ted Nugent came.
I've seen Blood on the Mountain is a really good documentary, and they have video from Ted Nugent is there playing whatever the 4th of July. Sean Hannity of Fox News was there, and I believe it was Don Blankenship in a American flag collared short sleeve T-shirt or something like that.
Interestingly enough, at my community college, my sociology teacher was one of the people that put together Blood on the Mountain.
Oh, yeah.
And that's actually why he's still teaching in Logan, because he's still fighting to keep Blair Mountain there.
That is an excellent documentary, by the way. Find it wherever you can. It surveys a lot of things about Apple. I think if you watch that and the documentary Hillbilly, which I think came out in 2018, those are both really good documentaries about the region. But yeah, they're telling you part of the story, and then again, you were growing up in the shadow of Blair, not Blood Mountain. That's in Georgia. Apparently around Blood. Now that I can't remember where the Cocaine Bear was. It was somewhere in Georgia where the Cocaine Bear happened, but it wasn't near Blood Mountain, I don't think, even though the movie said it was. But yeah, you live in the shadow of that, and they're just like, it's not here. We're not acknowledging, and and I think particularly with things, particularly as the like things like black lung benefit, and paying the weight and the toll and the sacrifice of the bodies and health of miners, and not wanting to do that, or doing as little as possible, But here's a big party here.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just kind of, which I think there's a kind of interesting thinking about that. There's a kind of interesting conflict, and clearly in Rocket Boys and both the film and the book the film October Sky, with feelings about the union, because again, he's a kind of in-betweener. Certainly, Homer Hickman's hanging out with all sorts of people, but his dad is a company man, and a lot of the people who are helping him are union miners. So it is this kind of I think he kind of tries to side skirt those things a little bit, where in the movie it's like the union is greedy and they want more money, and they're and that I believe John, he's for whatever reason he's named John in the movie, not to confuse the Hickams senior and junior, that he's the one keeping the mind together, which is like, boy, the 90s were very anti-union in films at the time. And again, a side note here, we're currently the Writers Guild of America strike. There's the SAG-AFTRA strike. People who are fighting for their rights, and not just for the rich, the Tom Cruises of the world, who are extremely well paid, but just the average working actor to get health benefits, to not get scanned by AI and then never, we don't need you anymore from here on out. So, I feel like this union battle that's coming up is going to be one of those ones, like, it's going to be a big one that's going to affect a lot of people. And I think certainly that excluding the union it's a little kind of not, you're only telling half the story here.
Yeah, definitely, because, outside of mines, West Virginia has a huge union history. I mean, our teachers' union, I'll never forget being in the 6th grade when the teachers went on strike, and my mom having to drive me past the strike, not across the picket line, but to my grandmother's house, and seeing my teachers out with their signs screaming at cars. Like, that was just, and it was a pride in that.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting, that we have, at least in my experience, a lot of pride for our teachers who are standing up. And yet when coal miners do it, it's kind of frowned upon. There's a lot of bad feelings about the UMWA. And I think it's a very interesting, once again, a parallel.
Yeah. I certainly, it wasn't too long ago, we had the teacher strike in 2018. That went on for a while. It was like at least almost 2 weeks, and basically put the state to a standstill for the most part. I remember it was a teacher. I was like, if any of you have kids and need to bring them into my class, please do, because we got to support the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't but yeah.
I think one of my final questions as we are rolling down here is about the difference in religion. A little bit before we started recording, I talked about how I had the joy of seeing Homer Hickman give a speech here at Marshall, and he discussed that what our denomination was, whatever the preacher was, because he was owned by the mine. But J.D. Vance, it's not until he gets much older, and he reconnects, I think, with his adopted dad, biological dad. I was very confused about who his father really was in the book. But we see very little religion in it. And I just found that very interesting, because the introduction to Hillbilly Elegy, he's all about, like, they're handling snakes and they handle religion weirdly. But then so much of his story was devoid of that religion. Yeah.
It's worth noting, is my kind of looking around, is that Vance converted to Catholicism in 2019. And he was probably, you don't just like, you wake up one day and convert to Catholic. You got to think about it a lot. And again, I'm not a Catholic, but the convert, they're hardcore. They're like, we're hardcore. We take this stuff very seriously. And I think, and he was originally scheduled, it was basically a book. I can't remember the title, and it was supposed to come out in 2023, basically about maintaining Christian values or something like that. I saw the description of it on Amazon when I was just checking it, and then it was gone. I was checking it the past few days, but his book got canceled last year.
Interesting.
So, and again, you would think just in a sheer money sense, that a book published this, I think it's estimated like 3 million copies, that someone would want to have that author's next book, but they said no, and they just kind of let it go. I don't know if he'll ever write another book, or if he's got the one waiting to find. I don't know, but yeah, I think that is something that's generally kind of, and I often wonder the time period at which these books came out, respectively, that wanting to kind of not get too into the religious aspects. But yeah, Hickman talks about, basically, the company and just whatever religion the preacher happened to be at the time. Yeah. But they have to, basically, there was the one preacher who, basically, the question of, like, should we, talks about the teachers, the teachers in the local school at Coalwood were like, we need to encourage students. We need to have them, don't diss the let the Rocket Boys have a chance to do their thing. And then the preacher basically has to say, like, he has to kind of split the difference between the company and the people. And then he eventually has to leave. He's asked to leave after that, I believe, or something like that. It seems something that is, marginal in some way, where I think it depends on the text. That some of them kind of emphasize religion more or less, and I kind of wonder at the publishing level if that's be very generalized. Don't get too specific because we don't. We want Protestant readers. We want Catholic readers. Whoever we want. So don't get too in the weeds about these things. It's something that I want to. And maybe it doesn't necessarily matter as much. Though I think maybe Vance's next book was going to have a lot to do with Christianity and Christian values. Those good old family values I remember from the 90s that everyone was talking about.
For sure. That's when you were talking and we were thinking, and you were talking about how little they touch it. I wonder if we're more strict about church attendance now than maybe back then, as weird as that seems. Because I know that growing up for me, some of my great-grandfathers built the church that I grew up in. And it was no matter what you're doing on Saturday night, I'm going to be there to take you to church on Sunday. And that's something that I was missing out of both of these was, and I mean, that's not a lot of my friends, but a fair enough of them also had this experience where your religion is not a choice. It's ingrown. So I found it very interesting, but you make a good point about publishers wanting to be lighter on the.
Yeah. And I think in certainly in the case of Hickman that's maybe not the primary. There's a lot going on in the book. It's 400 and close to 430 pages. So there's a lot going on, but I would say it's something that is de-emphasized very much in it. And I wonder to what extent. There's one point I think he's talking to Reverend Lanier. He wants to figuring out the right materials, figuring out the equations and everything, and he just wants him to pray really hard for it. And so there's at least in Rocket Boys, there's this disjunction between the science part and it's something that you have to figure out. And is there some sort of spiritual component to that? I don't know. It seems something like it's more the science, say there. So.
And as our final question for this podcast, so let's say somebody's listening to this, they haven't gotten into Appalachian literature very much, but they're interested in some of the things that we've been talking about. What kind of books or documentaries would you suggest someone start diving into if this is something that interests them?
Yeah, I would. Some of the ones that we had mentioned already, I think. Yes. This book, Denise Giardini's, I always mispronounce her name, Storming Heaven. It's got something for everybody. It is about the era of leading up to the mine wars, culminates in the Battle of Blair Mountain. It's got a love triangle that actually works. There's a baseball game. There's a battle. There is a hilarious scene of a first sexual encounter. It's a fantastic novel. It's the one I typically nowadays start with when I teach my class. It's a historical novel. It's really held up well since it was published in the 80s. That's a good place to start. As far as some of the other stuff I was teaching, if you like, a good example is poetry. Poetry of poets like David Bottoms, Rose McClarney. Is wonderful. McClarney writes a lot about environmentalism and a lot of it. She's from North Carolina. Also Ron Rash, if anybody's ever read Serena, which was made into a terrible movie, but the book is awesome. Let's see, who else? Thinking about some let's see here. So there's when you asked me this question, there's so many things I could recommend, and now I have a hard time picking things out. And Pancakes, Strange as This Weather Has Been, is a novel about mountaintop removal, and it's a really wonderful. It is a hard book. It is a hard book in terms of subject matter, but it also is wonderfully written. It also depicts the Buffalo. There's a chapter that deals with the Buffalo Creek flood disaster, which is really good. And an author that had passed away just recently, Cormac McCarthy. We think of him as this kind of author of the Southwest, but he spent his formative years in Knoxville, Tennessee, and he wrote some really early. I think he had basically his Appalachian phase, and then he had his Western phase, and some of his more Appalachian books is one called Child of God, which is fair warning about that one. It deals with a necrophiliac, but it's horrible and hilarious in so many ways. It's a funny book. I know it seems strange. And then he also did The Road, which is an environmental a book about an environmental disaster, which I think he kind of later in life kind of returns to that kind of Appalachian Southern setting that he had initially had. Thinking of one more person here.
I don't think you have to worry about the morbid with me. One of my favorite books is As I Lay Dying by Faulkner.
Oh, yeah.
I laugh all the way through it.
That's good stuff there. I read that when I was like in high school and just by myself. I enjoyed that one. So probably, I don't know if it's one of the more approachable ones. Let's see. I want to get some authors here. Yes. I wanted to give a little shout out also to, it's a book I'm making my way through right now. The author Alice Stein from Appalachian, Ohio, wrote Out of Winter, which is it's kind of basically a climate fiction book where things have become cold, like the temperature is frozen and everybody's kind of hanging on in this frozen landscape in southern Ohio. And then it gets to the point where people start to leave. And so it's like this adventure across this frozen Appalachian space. And she does a lot of thinking about things that are like more science fiction, fantasy, speculative work. So, and she's got a couple of books, Trash Lands. I believe she's got another one coming out. I've enjoyed reading those books. So some love to the not in the kind of naturalism or kind of melodrama aspects of Appalachia, more kind of the speculative. So,
thank you so much, Dr. Lumpkin. Are there any final thoughts or final messages that you'd like to leave our viewers and listeners with?
Well, I just like to thank you all for having me. And if you're out there, please read vigorously and voraciously, and do check out again. If you're curious, check out Hillbilly Elegy. It's not a book I would recommend, but if you have to, you have to. But I would definitely recommend Rocket Boys as a book. It's an excellent book, memoir, recollection. It's a good time. If you haven't read it, if you didn't read it in high school, then check it out at some point. So,
all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lumpkin.
Thank you.